Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share screen. Just give me 1 second. So, okay. So hopefully people online can see this. Welcome to today's seminar. I'm Andy Miller. I organize the department's seminar series. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce Felipe San, who's one of our PhD students in the department, who will introduce our guest speaker. Before I do, just wanted to point out, and this is actually on the announcement that was sent out. As you'll hear, our speaker was a producer of this documentary, and it's actually being shown on campus tomorrow. So I've included a link in the announcement that I sent out. You can get to this page, and then you can see the information about how to go to see it. It's tomorrow in the library and gallery at 4 to 6 p.m. And Rona, you'll be there, and then also the director and your co-producer will also both be there.
Yes.
So she'll say a little bit about that once we get started. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Felipe. He will introduce Rona, and then we'll have Rona take it away. I'll flip your slides back on screen before we start.
Hi everyone, my name is Felipe. I'm a PhD student in GES department, and I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. Rona Kobell is a co-founder in the Environmental Justice Journalism Institute. She has covered the Chesapeake Bay and its people for 20 years, beginning at Baltimore Sun, and then at Chesapeake Bay Journal, and most recently as the managing editor at the Chesapeake Bay Quarterly magazine. She has taught at Loyola University, Towson University, UMBC, and the University of Maryland, where she recently earned her MA in journalism. For 5 years, she co-hosted and co-produced the Chesapeake Bay show on WYPR. Her writing has appeared in Slate, Grist, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, National Parks magazine, and many other publications. Her work has won 2 Apex Awards for communication excellence, 1 MARCOM Platinum Award for research paper writing, the Lowell Thomas Award, bronze for national environmental travel reporting, the Rachel Carson Award for women greening journalism for the National Audubon Society, and several honors from the Maryland-Delaware-DC Press Association. Baltimore Magazine named her Best Bay Watcher in 2015. She has written and co-produced 3 films, including Eroding History. Rona has named 2003, 2023, and 2024 SNF AGORA Fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where she's working on a book on the topics explored in Eroding History. Thank you, Rona.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so Rona, go ahead and say a word about that, and then I'll flip the slides on the screen so you don't have to worry about it.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. I taught at UMBC last year. I did a class with Dr. Earl Brooks. It was a class about the sounds of environmental injustices, and we had a great time. If you can get a class with him, I highly suggest it. We're going to be showing this film tomorrow, as Professor Miller said. And what I really love about the film is it brings the concepts that I'm going to talk about to life. It's awfully hard to tell stories about land. You know, land doesn't talk, and land changes slowly. So we are telling a story about land with people who live on the land. And I think it's a beautifully directed and shot film. You know, we have shown it 32 times. Tomorrow will be 33, and we have just gotten incredible feedback on it. We've won some festival awards, so we're very proud of it. And I think if you are interested in what I'm talking about today, this will be a good complement to it.
Okay, I'll just flip up the slides on, and then we take it away. Okay, there we go. So I think that's down over there. Yes, if you want to add the slides or use the pointer.
Yes,
Here it
okay.
is. I can stop talking.
So first, I want to ask you all if you are familiar with the concept of redlining. Everybody? Okay, does someone want to tell us what it is? I don't know any of your names, so whoever thinks they have the best definition, yes, please.
It's refusing to ensure or give a loan to someone in a certain area that is deemed high risk or not financially feasible to, but historically it has been used as basically racism, real estate, and basically taking people's life savings, which is most of our homes, and making it worthless and by drawing a red line.
Right. Redlining, does anyone know where redlining began, where the first place to do it was? Right here, right, Baltimore. Baltimore was the first place to codify redlining. Now, other places were surely discriminating against people, but Baltimore decided to put it in a code. And this happened because a Black attorney moved into a neighborhood where the white establishment of Baltimore did not want him to live and decided that they needed to have a code. And so that's why when you drive around Baltimore, you see neighborhoods like Cherry Hill that are sort of cut off from everything with highways. That's where the city sort of deemed that Black soldiers coming back from the war would live. And there were covenants and restrictions, insurance restrictions, housing restrictions, all of that against Black people, against Jewish people, against other people who were not white citizens. What I've discovered in my work, which most of my work has been on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, is that a similar system developed in the rural areas, and I have come to call it rural redlining. And it was not deliberate lines on a map like Baltimore City, but the results in many ways are the same, in that a lack of being able to build generational wealth, a dearth of home ownership and land ownership, and other issues that I'm going to talk about in my slides. So, a lot of people have talked about the moral imperatives of climate change, in that everything happening to the community at large is happening to the Black community first, right? So Black communities in rural areas tend to have lower land because that's what they were able to get, what they were able to buy. They have worse drainage, less acreage in preservation or in restored wetlands, and less political capital to make changes. It doesn't have to be this way. Solutions abound to make the situation more equitable. They involve local, state, and federal governments. They also include private investments, and these are steps that we can take now as we go to renewable fuels. It is not an either or. I've heard a lot of people say, well, you know, we can't stop this. It's coming our way. People are going to suffer. That's just kind of how it is until we work it out. But as is clear to any of us who follow the news, there is not an equal suffering. I can tell you, I went to the Eastern Shore this weekend with my daughter, who's 12, and she remarked upon how wet everything was. And I said, could you imagine what it would be like if this happened at our house? And she said, oh, Mom, they would probably close school if the roads were like this. And this was not a storm. This was just an average rainfall. She doesn't see that kind of weather in where we live, which is Towson, which is not exactly a privileged place, but it is a hill. So we have a hill which we live on. And so we don't, when it rains, the water goes into the drain and disappears, and we don't really see it. On the Eastern Shore, that doesn't happen in many areas, particularly where we were, which was in one of the rural communities, going to a church service. So I'm going to be talking about 10 ways that land policies discriminate, and one town that shows what it looks like when they don't. Okay. One way is taxation without representation. How many Black representatives in Maryland State House how many Black representatives represent the Eastern Shore in the Maryland State House? Does anyone have a guess? One. There's one delegate from Easton, a Black woman who represents the Eastern Shore. The rest of the representatives from the Eastern Shore are pretty much white conservative Republicans, many of whom deny climate change. So if you're dealing with a problem, let's say you live on Deal Island, from Princess Anne to Winona, which is 19 miles, there is no mayor, there is no councilman, there is nobody representing you who understands your issues. And your delegate and your senator are conservative Republicans who question whether or not climate change exists. You're not going to get that much support for your issues. And so a lot of people call Charlotte Delegate Sample Hughes because she is a Black woman who understands a lot of these issues, but she has her constituents to represent. And, you know, imagine being the only person to sort of handle all of that. Part of the reason for this is because the way the Eastern Shore is gerrymandered, Black people aren't getting representation. And you even see it in the county councils. So the Talbot County Council, Talbot County is where St. Michael's and Easton and Oxford are. So it's one of the more progressive counties on the shore. It was the only shore county, I think, that voted for Westmore. Their Talbot County elects its representatives at large. It took 300 years to get a Black representative on their council, and he got in because he got appointed because somebody left. So what at large means is that the entire county votes for the 3 members. So it's not districted. If it was, like I live in Baltimore County, we have districts. We still could have more diverse representation, but we have 7 districts. So everybody in my district votes for the person we want to represent them. And that way you're able to get more diversity. But if it's all at large, you need to get the majority to vote for a minority, and it's not easy. Finally, a woman was just elected in her own right to the Talbot County Council. But it is difficult. And what's happening now is recently the town of Federalsburg, which also had that kind of representation, the NAACP sued, and they've recently carved up their voting into districts, and now they have finally elected a Black woman also. So it's changing very slowly. And so without voices to advocate for what you need, you often don't get what you need. Okay. This is what we call a ghost forest. I took this picture on a bike ride a couple months ago. I have a lot of pictures of ghost forests in my role. I shared this one because there's a sign and you can see where it is. So the ghost forest is happening because saltwater intrusion is coming up and is killing the trees. So behind that, you see a healthy forest, and then you see these spiny trees. They've been killed by salt. And so a lot of saltwater intrusion is happening because of climate change, but some of it is also happening because of groundwater withdrawals from agriculture, which I don't have to tell you all because you are students of Dr. Miller, so you probably know way more about this than I do. But the geology of the ground changes when you're withdrawing water, and the salt water comes in and it kills the trees. And a lot of times I'll be driving along the shore, and instead of this, what I'll see is what looks like a parking pad in the middle of a farm field. And that's where the salt has come up and killed some poor farmers' crops. So this is an issue that, you know, you could deal with it in multiple ways. I don't really think anyone has done anything about it, except for doing some research on salt tolerant crops. Okay, this is, my daughter took this picture. This is a healthy forest, but you can see the water coming in. This will probably be a ghost forest before too long. Okay. This is the driveway. There was a house there. It's not there anymore. You see this a lot on the Eastern Shore. And what happened was that the drainage in a lot of these Black communities is poor. And the counties choose which communities are going to get the attention to drain the ditches. They don't have a huge public works department, so they prioritize the places where most people live. The people who live in this community told me that they haven't really had their ditches tended to in 10 to 15 years. And so when that happens, you get this standing water in the ditch, and then you get a lot of flooding, not during just rains, but also high tide events. And so over time, what happens is people abandon their homes. Their homes get run down, they can't pay the taxes on them, and they leave. And the homes crumble and fall into disrepair. So this is a driveway without a house, but there were other driveways on the street where the house was in disrepair. Just, it still existed, but it had fallen down. And so when I say, you know, there are things you can do about this, you can, you know, put some money into your budget and tend to all of your residents so that you're not neglecting some drains and tending to other drains. There is also another issue, which I can address maybe later in the questions about whose responsibility it is to maintain all these ditches. Some of them are state ditches, some of them are county ditches, and some of them are agricultural ditches that are owned by a separate association that the taxpayers actually don't have any control over, and that is another issue. Okay. Steeples without people. This is Malone's Church. These are some friends of mine, Alex and Lisa Green, who are very committed Harriet Tubman storytellers. And this is an old church that is falling down. They recently got $250,000 from the National Park Service after many years of not getting anything. And they're trying to restore their church. But what's happened is the preservation funds in Maryland have long been geared towards manors and mansions and lighthouses. And these manors and mansions, we call them, you know, manors and mansions, but they're really old plantations. And we've invested in restoring them without necessarily telling the story of what actually happened there, but spending the money to make them beautiful and then, you know, allowing public tours, while we really neglected a lot of the Black churches. This in particular is an important church because this was Harriet Tubman's old church, and buried in the cemetery are many Tubman family members. So of all the churches, this is one that you would think would be more of a high priority, but even that connection hasn't really helped it, as you see from the picture. And so there was an African-American, and there still is, an African-American Heritage Preservation Fund. And it didn't have very much money in it until recently. It was up to $1 million, and then Wes Moore bumped it up to $5 million, which is great. But all of the African-American projects go into that fund. And then there's this other fund for all the other things. And so it's almost like a segregated process of how you do historic preservation, and many, many worthy projects don't get funded. So we're very glad that Malone's Church did, but there needs to be more equity in preservation. Again, with the ditches. So there are two ditches here. So this is one ditch. This is more of the typical Eastern Shore ditch. So you see like along the way, and then there's this water. And then the water will eventually drain into another body of water, which will eventually drain into a bigger one. So the ditches, we call them ditches, but they're not ditches like you and I know ditches where we live. It's a different kind of situation. It's almost like a point source, really. And a lot of times it gets very high. I think I have another picture of it. Oh, I don't have it here. I have it later. I have a picture of it that shows how high it gets. And then this, what we're looking at in this picture, I mean, this probably looks pretty typical of what we've seen in like parking lots and like shopping centers, but this is kind of different because this is a canal that was dug by enslaved people. It's called Stewart's Canal, and it was dug because the Eastern Shore was in tobacco. And then around like 1790, it switched over to timber, in part because tobacco is kind of hard on the land, and the land needed to rest a bit from all the tobacco that was being grown, and they switched to timber. And the enslaved people timbered the land, but it needed to get out to Baltimore because the timber was going up to Baltimore and beyond for the building boom that was the 1800s in Maryland and the United States. So Mr. Stewart, who owned the area, decided that his enslaved people would build a canal so that the wood could be floated up. So this is the vestige of the canal. And so the canal is no longer used, but the canal has dug into the land. And so you have drainage issues, and you have these sort of gates that are not very well maintained. And so you get this dirty-ish water in the canal. It is supposed to flow out into Madison Bay, which flows into the Chesapeake, but it's often very stagnant. And this is one of the big places where the canals were, but it's not the only place. It's kind of interesting though, because when you go by the canal, you can see that it looks a little different from other Eastern Shore drainage areas because it was dug with such precision. It looks like an Army Corps of Engineers project. And even all these years later, it's still very precise the way it was dug. So it's kind of a double whammy in that the very people who were oppressed and enslaved were forced to dig this canal, and now the canal is impacting the remaining land that they have, and that the land is kind of sloping down because of this canal. Okay, preservation without plans. This is one of my favorite stories to tell, and probably will be the chapter in my book that I'm trying to write now. Unsuccessfully, I might add, because there are too many other things going on. But back in Maryland has this phenomenal program called Program Open Space that some of you are probably aware of, where Maryland buys land and preserves it for parks. This predates that. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, Maryland Department of, what was the predecessor of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, bought something called the Minokan Gun Club. It was a hunting preserve, and they bought it from these hunters who didn't want it anymore, and they put it in preservation. It was next to a Black community called Dames Quarter, along this road called Riley Roberts Road. The Maryland State Department that bought this did not bother to check with the Black community when they did it, and they bought this land and they decided to flood it for duck hunting purposes, and so they did. And you can to this day go there and duck hunt or crab because it's all wet. And that flooding, not surprisingly, impacted Dames Quarter and Riley Roberts Road, and it was a thriving Black community, and now there are maybe 2 original residents, one of whom is in her late 80s and has had a lot of flooding. There are a couple other people who live there, but it's basically people who have hunting, they hunt and they have like a part-time place there to like store their stuff. It's not really like a place where a lot of people live. It's a bit like a ghost town. So there were other issues with this preserve. They tried to make these mosquito ditches, which ended up creating a bigger problem with flies. There were other things, but more recently, as in a couple of years ago, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was dredging near the Wacomico River, and they needed to make a channel for the ships to go by, and they didn't have any place in Wacomico to put the sediment. We used to call it dredge spoil, but I don't know what the appropriate term is now, but all the stuff, you know, that you need to clear the mud. And so they basically dumped it here. They still didn't notify the residents of Dames Quarter, in part because they sent letters, but you know, if people aren't in their homes permanently, they're not going to get the letters. The white community who lives on the other side of Dames Quarter is furious when they saw this digging and these pipes. So what they're doing is basically piping the dredge into this land. Now, it is not necessarily a bad thing, right? You have this land that's sinking and they're piping new sediment in. So on its face, I don't think it's so terrible, but you need to explain this to people. You need to tell them what you're doing. This is their home, right? And they didn't do that. And so I snapped this picture when they were pretty much done with the what they were doing. And you can see the pipe, and it's kind of a mess, but you know, eventually it'll be nicer, I think. But the idea that like you would just be receptacle for another county's, you know, dirt did not sit well with some of the people. Okay, septics without connections. This is a guy named Gene. I don't remember his last name. It was so long ago. And he is standing in front of a lot that he owns, and you can see water, and that is a failing septic field. So basically, the Eastern Shore developed very quickly after the bridge was built, and they didn't have proper policies in place for waste. And so, and they didn't have a lot of public sewer because it was a largely undeveloped area. And so they built very quickly on septic systems, but sometimes the septic system did not have a big enough drain field to capture the waste. And so the waste went basically into the creeks. And that's what's happening here. This is a place on Kent Island. So what's happening in a lot of the Black communities is the public sewer line stopped at the last white community, and the Black communities further away didn't get public water and sewer. So what does that mean? It means that the government comes by and says, you got to upgrade your septic system. It's polluting the bay. Okay, we don't want that. Well, how do I do that? Well, it's going to cost you, this much money. And, well, can you help me find a contractor? No, we don't really do that. So you're kind of on your own to fix a system like this. And it's very expensive. In fact, when I went to the church in Smithville on Sunday, I was leaving and the deacon said to me that one of the church members was going underneath the church to check and make sure the sump pump was working because there had been so much rain. So this is an untenable system, right? A solution to it would be to hook up the lower income Black communities onto sewer. But counties are hesitant to do that because it costs money, and to put in a sewer system when there's only 3, 4, or 5 people left in the community, is not a good waste of money, a good way to spend taxpayer money. However, that is also not what you want to see. And the government of Somerset County did recently spend a few $1 million to put in a new sewage treatment system on Smith Island, where there are only about a couple hundred people. And when I asked, wouldn't it be cheaper to move everyone off the island? They said, well, yeah, it would be, but that's not what we're going to do. As long as they want to stay there, we will build the system for them. So it's not like unprecedented to extend public water and sewage to rural areas. It just hasn't really happened in the Black community. Okay. This is about valley proteins, odors without answers. There is a rendering plant on the Eastern Shore. It's situated in a Black community right around it. And it's been a problem for decades. Only recently have environmental groups complained about it because they were using an old permit and they were discharging too much. And some farmers lost a dog passed away, and they made quite a big stink about it, no pun intended, to deal with this. The Maryland Department of the Environment took the unprecedented step of shutting them down for a couple weeks to basically get things in order, but then reissued them a permit. So we have basically allowed this kind of pollution to occur in rural areas, and we haven't really done what needs to be done to address flaws in permits. I mean, it literally went on for years. I've talked to people who grew up in this area, and they said like there were times in the 70s when you couldn't go outside your house, like you couldn't go into your garden. And so this is something that when we think about environmental justice in all communities, not just Black communities, we think about this. And this is a problem on the Eastern Shore as well. It's not just a city problem. Okay. This is from a story that I did in the Washington Post, and it's about the issue of generational wealth in the Black watermen's community. So Black watermen have been a staple of Maryland since it was founded. They oystered, they crabbed, they fished. They were a huge part of the pleasure boat industry. And sometime in the 1900s, a law was passed that made it much harder for Black captains to get licenses. And so if you're not a captain on a boat, you're basically a mate, and you don't get paid as much and you don't have as much control. Well, in the 1970s, there were 2 Black captains. One of them was named Thompson Wallace. And he worked very hard to get the boat you see in the picture, which is called the Claude Summers. And one of the reasons why it was so difficult for him to get the boat is because the white captains didn't want him to have it because he was such a good waterman. They wanted him to work on their boats. He finally got the boat and he went out on a blustery day with 7 members of his family to catch oysters. And they got caught in a storm and they all drowned, all of them. And so as a result, the boat was saved. Someone found it, someone restored it, and it's now in a museum in Virginia. But as a result of the end of that legacy, it was very difficult for the Wallace sons to continue in the water industry. Their mother did not want the surviving sons to be involved. And then the other Black waterman, when he passed away, his kids didn't continue. And that sort of became the end of Black watermen. They were stopped at every turn from getting the generational wealth that this built. I know a lot of watermen, white watermen on the Chesapeake Bay who have sent their kids to college on oyster money, crab money. This is big. This was at one time big money. And so to be left out of that equation really harmed Black watermen. And you'll see in the film tomorrow, we talk about, the lack of identity of Black watermen, that a lot of them aren't named like white watermen are in terms of like the legacy and the stories. Okay, this is the interchange near Berlin, Maryland, near Ocean City. And I picked this. There's many examples in Baltimore and elsewhere of freeways breaking up Black communities. Famously, the Highway to Nowhere in West Baltimore broke up West Baltimore, and my producing partner made a film about that, which he might talk about a little bit tomorrow. It's called Disruption, Baltimore's Highway to Nowhere. This also happens in rural areas, and this is Berlin, Maryland, as I said. There was a Black community called Brittletown, and it basically got destroyed because of the highway. Salisbury also, the highway went through the Black community. I think it even went through a cemetery or the bypass. And so there's not enough care given when you build roads about communities. And this has happened in just about every major city has a highway that has bisected and destroyed a middle-class Black community. I know Baltimore has one. I know Chicago has one. I'm from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has one. I mean, it's a fairly common thing. I don't know how many more highways we're building since we're trying to get away from driving, but certainly as we look to the future about how to build sustainably, we have to recall what we've done. Okay, so we've talked about all these problems, and I started to think, well, what if there was a town, a Black town, that didn't have any of these issues? What if there was a town that had its own zoning, it could incorporate, it had its own leaders who had authority, it was on high ground, and it could, basically control its own destiny? And there is such a town. It's called Highland Beach. So I just want to point out to you, the brown house is Frederick Douglass's summer house, where he never got to live, but his son built this community and built that house for him. The house in the middle belonged to Mary Church Terrell, who was a civil rights leader, and the blue one on the end was Paul Laurence Dunbar. He's a famous poet. Was his summer place. So you can see how different this community looks from the other slides I showed you, right? There are beautiful lawns. There are, there's no drainage issues. All the houses, there's houses, no driveways without houses. It looks really different. It's very bright. It's very cheery. And there are 2 incorporated communities in Anne Arundel County. One is Annapolis, which has, 40,000 people, and the other is Highland Beach, which has maybe 500 people. And so the fact that Frederick Douglass's son was able to get this incorporated was a huge deal. It was incorporated in, I think, 1924, and Governor Ritchie at the time signed off on it so that it could be incorporated. And so they have their own zoning, and so you'll notice there's space between the houses. Every house has to be built on a double lot so that they have room. There's no condos in this community. It's very nice. They have identified, their streets. It's like they have a branding, so people know this is a historically Black community. And I just this is just a really pretty house, very typical. A lot of space, a lot of land for drainage, not mansion, but nice, right? Well kept, all that. So Highland Beach's biggest problem right now is gentrification. They want to remain a historically Black community, but people can live wherever they want now, and that means white people and Black people. So wealthy Black people might not necessarily want to live in Highland Beach because they might want something else, and wealthy white people might think, well, that appeals to me, I'm going to move there, and they may not necessarily care about the history. So they're struggling to keep their identity because it's become very desirable to live by the water, and particularly in Annapolis. And because of all these restrictions, it's a very nice community. It's beautiful. So those are all the slides. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to express in this book that I'm working on, that came out of my master's and the film that we're making, is that rural redlining may not have been deliberate, and it may not have been a sort of a cabal where a bunch of people sit in a room and decide we're gonna discriminate. But I think the results of the redlining have been catastrophic for Black families on the Eastern Shore, many of whom are collective descendants, I would say, of Harriet Tubman, in that they're not actually, Harriet. Some of them are Harriet Tubman's descendants, but a lot of them are just part of the descendants of the part of the community that nurtured her and helped her do what she did. Their families have been there for generations, and this is kind of how it's seeming to unfold for them, is land that isn't worth very much, land that is flooded, inability to stay in their homes. And so I think that's what drives me and the work that I'm doing, is, some sort of more just result than what I'm seeing. And I am happy to take any questions that any of you have.
We're doing fine on time. We have time for questions. Thank you. And we'll take questions in the room. You can just pick on anybody who raises their hand, and then we might have time for people who are online.
Okay. Yes.
Question on why specifically you chose Highland Beach to compare rural Black communities to. I spent a lot of time in recently. I've prayed there a lot. And I, in my own digging, basically found out of the historical Black community, but from spending time there, I did not see that at all as still being a Black community. It's extremely gentrified now.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if we can say that, or that's a Black community that kind of survived and did better than, say, other Black communities on the Eastern Shore. I know it's not on these persons,
Right.
but I'm just wondering if we can attest that to the fact that it was historically Black, or if that is possibly because it's been so gentrified over time.
Well, that's a really good question. So, part of fighting against all these things is also fighting to hold on to your culture, and fighting gentrification, and fighting to remain historically as you are. I picked Highland Beach because I knew the mayor. I've interviewed him several times, and I had done a story some years ago about he and his wife had been very successful at getting grants to redo their town hall, put in a green roof, do a lot of rain gardens. And I was impressed with how proactive they were. It's unusual to have a mayor of a small town who has a PhD in environmental justice, as Dr. Sanders has. And so it was impressive to me that he was working really hard to do that. It's not really surprising to hear that it's gentrified more now. But I think they have a real challenge. There's another Eastern Shore town called Bellevue that is in a similar situation. It was a wonderful, historically Black town, very prosperous. And there was a family called the Turners who owned seafood business, and eventually they owned two. So there was Turner and Son, and then Turner Seafood. One was oysters and crabs, and the other one was clams. And it was a hugely successful operation until the mid-90s when it closed, and basically people moved and left. And so now it's still kind of a historic Black community, but it's not really anymore because it's in Talbot County, it's on high ground, and people are moving there. You know, I think that's, if I could have found a town on the Eastern Shore that I thought was completely analogous, I would have picked it, but there were no incorporated Black towns on the shore. So that's why I picked Highland Beach, but also because it is the other successful town, Black town, is Eagle Harbor in Prince George's County, but it wasn't quite as storied as Highland Beach. So, yeah. Did I answer that? Okay.
I'm just gonna put play to the screen, so but keep going.
Okay. Yes.
So it seems pretty clear that what would make the problem a lot better would be, like, better representation for those communities so that they could, like, convince their representatives to help them. How do you think one would go about getting that? Because, like, is it a redistricting issue? Is it, like, what sort of a thing could someone who lives in that community, like, to fix that?
I mean, it's hard because, you know, we have proportional representation, which is representation based on how many people live somewhere. So, you know, the whole of Deal Island from Princess Anne to the end probably has maybe 1,000 people. So it's not a lot of people. And so it's not necessarily surprising that they don't really have representation. I mean, I think one thing that would help is giving more power to the towns, because towns, you know, the town of Pocomoke or the town of Princess Anne, we're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 people in town. If the towns had more money and more authority, they could make better decisions for their towns. But instead, they kind of always have to go to the county and ask Mother May I for funds. So that would be one way. Pocomoke, Princess Anne, or, you know, or Chrisfield just elected a Black mayor. I mean, they're all starting to get pretty actively involved in these issues. But it's not like they necessarily have funding. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is to just really educate the people who are in power. I mean, Andy Harris has been the congressman on the Eastern Shore for quite a long time. And I've never spoken to anyone who felt like he was effective or helpful. Many people have tried to unseat him. Nobody has. It's hard. I mean, it's a Democrat, it's a Republican stronghold over there, and you need a strong Republican who's willing to take him on, and because the Democrats aren't winning, and I have not seen that happen. So that's probably what needs to happen, is people need to be aware of who their legislators are and what they're actually doing for them. And when they're not, you know, doing things, they need to go. If you're spending your time in Congress, you know, participating in silly things and not dealing with the issues that affect your constituencies, then maybe you shouldn't be reelected, whatever party you're in.
Other questions?
Yes. Oh, you stayed. Yay.
I was wondering, like, so isn't there like a hospital problem where there's a hospital and the nearest hospital is in Chrisfield, and Smith Island is like, oh, there's like, it's like far away, and I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. That's definitely an issue. And the way people get to and from Smith Island is either by boat or by medevac plane. So if you're sick and you need to go to the hospital, you usually get flown. So that's an issue as people age, because young people aren't moving to Smith Island by and large. The people who are there are getting older, and as they age, a lot of them are finding that they need to move to Crisfield if they have needs. So yeah, I think the future of that island is an interesting question, which I haven't really dealt with in my research, but I've done a lot of previous stories on it. Yes.
Rona, thanks for this, and I'm excited to see the book once it comes to fruition. There's a graduate student in our program who has been interviewing tribal leaders from different Maryland tribes about a lot of work related to environmental justice questions, but some of them have been leaders from Eastern Shore tribes and Pocomoke and Assaway-Wash. And they've been also noting about sort of trying to access land that was ancestrally theirs, and also this issue of sea level rise. And I just was wondering, there obviously too, representation is an enormous issue, and these tribes aren't state recognized. But have a very strong presence. And I was wondering if you've been focusing on historically Black communities, but have you seen any sort of I don't know, interaction or coalition building happening on the Eastern Shore among communities who across the board are sort of marginalized?
I haven't, and I would love to talk to the student who's working on this because, yeah, I mean, I know there are Native communities on the Eastern Shore and they're not recognized. I believe the Piscataway is the only state recognized tribe, but certainly there are a lot of remnants, like you'll pass a lot of roads that will say Indian Bone Road or Indian River Road, and that at one time that was Indian land, or Native American land. So most of the Native tribes were basically expatriated from here in the 1730s and 40s, and so they've been out of Maryland for a very long time. Virginia seems to have a stronger tribe connection than we do, with many more active participants trying to save land. So, I mean, I would love to dig into it because they did have the land first. And if we had continued to use the land the way they did, we would still have issues with climate change, but we might not have as many because of the way we have farmed the land and corn and not done some of the rotating practices that they did. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I have kind of focused my research on Black communities and the Maryland part of the Eastern Shore and 4 counties, because otherwise I felt like it would just be too sprawling and I wouldn't be able to tackle it. So I think there's so much more to do, but I'm sort of focusing. I would like to focus on just Somerset and Dorchester, but that's a little too narrow. So I'm going into Talbot a little bit, and Caroline and Worcester.
So it's 12:50. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more short questions if people have them. And if no one in the room raises their hand, is there anyone who's online who would like to unmute and ask a question? I kind of jerry-rigged this. I'm not even sure how it's going to wind up in terms of the recording, but.
Andy, you have one in the room.
Oh, okay, please.
Unless somebody else has one.
Nobody else has said anything.
I found this very insightful, and I really have taken many things away from it. And I'm wondering, is there like a resource? Obviously, the documentary tomorrow and the book, but that will come out. Is there like a specific resource where someone could go and be like a student or staff or whoever, and could be like, these are things to take action and representation and I mean, is there, and I know that's like an all-encompassing thing and ever transitioning thing as well. But is there a source or something that you found in your research that was like, oh my gosh, this is such a wealth of information and helpful for someone to become take action as opposed to feel overwhelmed and just shut down.
I wish there was. If there was, I probably wouldn't be writing this book because I've been looking for that. And I think it's hard to connect all the dots. It's taken me a long time to figure out these connections. So, I mean, I have relied on a lot of different books that have helped me sort of historically learning about Maryland's the way we farmed and sort of the management historically here. One of the best books that I read for that my master's thesis was called Slavery and Freedom on the Middle Ground. And it's basically about Maryland's Eastern Shore. It was written by a historian named Barbara Jean Fields, who's become quite well known now, but it was her dissertation for her PhD. And she won a big prize for best dissertation. So it's very good. And it explains a lot about the representation issues going back